I will try to keep my comments very short so we have more time for questions going forward. As it was mentioned, I am a banker, so amongst everyone, but I'm, by training, academic training, I'm a historian and political scientist, so I've been working in banking. My comments today I will keep in banker format, so we'll talk in bullet points to try to make it very clear to you just a framework for thinking about where we're going in terms of democracy and trying to promote democracy under the Western paradigm. Myself, I have a few fears that I will preface this by, and some of them have been mentioned by other panelists. First is the fear of nationalism in a global world and global economy, which can only bring tears to all of us. And secondly, and paradoxically, the limits of democracy on a global scale. And so how we put those together. Politics for me is only one, is only one part of democracy. For me, the leading part of democracy that we've seen over the last 100 years has been different forms of capitalism, which drive for a more open political society. Democracy as a political institution is very difficult if you can't have economic development, economic openness to be able to follow along. For this reason, economic integration and coordination is essential to stabilize Western democracy. As was mentioned in the introductory video, I'd like to go back and talk a bit about something that we can look at from the US standpoint that was put forward by President Roosevelt, which is looking at how do we create public utility in every form of democratic life. And I'm going to focus specifically on something that I spoke on last time if people were here, or I mentioned and was asked to speak a little bit more this evening, on directed capitalism. And what is capitalism, or what should be capitalism, in a global democracy. As a society, I think we need to focus on how do we support economic development and coordination. And if we go back and think about some of the successes that we've had in doing that, in all of the examples where I found that we've actually had success is when we had a clear social utility to the economic model or the capitalistic model that we were putting in place or pushing forward. And you can think about Roosevelt, you can think about all the, the Eisenhower and things that were put forward, also in Europe. When we had a social utility behind economic development and coordination, things went well. The problem is when you lose sight of the social utility. And that, I think, is a bit about what we've had over the last several years. When you're looking at social utility, you ask questions as, where should funds be directed? That's very clear. Why aren't funds currently being directed there? What are the medium-term gains of society in directing funds? And what are the short-term losses that society could take in having a directed form of capitalism? In all of this, we end up with one very large risk, and that's the risk of populism, which, if we're looking in Europe today, we lost sight over the last decade of what was capitalism. What should capitalism be? Capitalism should be a good form of economic development if it's properly managed and properly directed. But when we lose sight, you can end up with some train wrecks, and that's essentially what we've had around the globe in different forms. That then leads back to populism, which is the problem that we're having today, where economic policy is now being formed based on supporting voters' political agendas, and not on developing the economy for a medium-term success of the entire population. Very often, optimal decisions on economic development may be very difficult and unpopular to make. If we think about decisions that should be made that are positive for the economy and for the society, first of all, closing down unproductive factories. Very difficult to have been done in the US, but it was done. Almost impossible to be done in Europe today, where we continue to waste funding to support industries which are non-productive and have no raison d'être in the economy of an individual country. Secondly, we look at things like farm subsidies. Something that's very difficult, and as interesting and easy as it may sound, is forcing farmers to change the crops they grow. Again, in the US, we've been through this. We managed to do it. You force people to grow soybeans instead of corn. In Europe, we still have problems. Why, in cold climates in Europe, are we still subsidizing farmers to grow tomatoes when they could be growing something that was much more productive, and leaving tomatoes to be grown in northern Africa and the Mediterranean? This brings us back to what I'll come back to more directed capitalism, which is how do we as a society try to direct the transformation of industries and sectors, which again is something that is very difficult because it's become entrenched in the psyche of certain countries. In the UK, I was watching the BBC News last night, they bring up another issue, which is, do we support large enterprise or do we support small enterprise? Do you support the large supermarket who hires 100 to 200 people, or do you support the small grocers on the high street who employ 2 or 3 people? How do you balance out the two, and what is best for a society moving forward? The UK government has taken a great initiative moving forward in trying to deal with these things through the funding for lending. I would say it's a good initiative. Implementation has been quite questionable, simply because they throw a lot of money at something without knowing what the objective is that they're trying to get out of the money that they're throwing in. So it goes back to the original question is, where should funds be directed? Why aren't they going there? And what's the positive and negative of pushing those funds, which is something that the government didn't really do. They just said, throw money at the problem, maybe that will help us out. I would also like to make one comment on something that I'll close very quickly, but this is my last comment, on corporate governance. Something that was mentioned by one of the previous speakers. We need to have rules that are placed in society, whether that be on banks or others, and reward systems to be able to promote social utility, as well as to be able to punish excessive risk-taking and non-utilitarian activities. We also need, as a society, to develop clear guidance on what is the social utility that we want to have for our economy. Thank you.